why pop culture is so appealing to masses. So we mentioned before that it's closely connected to businesses and economy. And without developed economy, pop culture might not be developing as fast. Well, one reason why pop culture might be so appealing to people is new trends, because it's constantly revising itself to cater to mass tastes. Another reason might be inclusivity. Pop culture is very inclusive and can be produced at any time by any person or group of people. And the last one is repetition. The same message with slightly new content being repeated over and over is actually, interestingly, very attractive for mass audiences. There's been research that shows that songs that have repetitive lines in its lyrics have a significantly higher probability of making it into Billboard charts. So a song's success is partially defined by whether it has repetition in it or not. And there's a lot of research on what is it about repetition that's so appealing to human mind. There's all kinds of scientific explanations and hypotheses, but overall it's pretty interesting because pop culture is very repetitive itself, and we'll take a look at some examples today, which might partially explain why it's essentially popular culture. Let's move on to the next slide. So, repetition. On the one hand, it might be the secret of the popularity of all those movies that are oriented upon commercial success, or songs, or music, and so on. On the other hand, that's the term that Debussy quotes in his textbook, humiliating repetition, something that really devalues and brings down the quality of art. So we can take a look at it in two different ways. Think about every single plot that you've seen being repeated endlessly throughout the decades of pop culture's development. Vampire series or vampire movies. After the success of one book series, then we see endless TV shows and movies that just keep being released. And somehow this repetitive narrative is still popular. Same with spy movies. Somehow the same exact narrative being repeated over and over. Usually it involves some kind of Russian spy or Russian conspiracy, very popular. Love comedies, the same thing. Usually those love comedies are based on a very similar plot. It follows the story of two people, they fight, they get together, then they fight again, then they get together, and then you see a happy end. So every time you watch them, you know exactly how it's going to end, yet every time one of those comedies is released, it collects significant revenues. So humiliating repetition is pretty much the core element of popular culture, and partially, while it might explain its popularity overall, it also might want us to start thinking about what kind of effect it has not only on the society, but also on the quality of art that we're producing. Let's move on to the next slide. Pop art. So actually, obviously, it's not the first time in history when people started thinking about this repetition in popular culture. And in fact, there was a whole artistic movement that embraced that repetition and used it to produce something that actually turned out to be of artistic value. So artists like Andy Warhol emphasized the role of everyday life experiences in people's perception of reality in the 50s and 60s in Britain. But on top of that, they also used the idea of repetition and actually showed it as something artistically valuable instead of criticizing it. So they embraced the reality of pop culture and turned it into something beautiful and valuable. Modern artists like Jeff Koons kept working with this artistic tradition, sometimes taking it to the extreme. If you look up Jeff Koons' sculptures, they're very exaggerated. In a very exaggerated manner, they look like cartoon characters. Sometimes they look like very simple elements of pop culture, like a heart-shaped statue. What could be more pop culture themed than that? A shiny, glossy heart, and that's it. Yet, certain art experts find some artistic value in this type of culture. So interestingly, pop art actually started embracing the very first element that's usually being criticized about pop culture, and they developed something new using that idea. And that's a pretty interesting way to look at it. Also, if you saw some of Andy Warhol's paintings, they're very repetitive. Sometimes he repeats the same figure 9 or several times, usually 9 times, in one picture. So it literally repeats the same image 9 times, which sort of plays with this idea of humiliating repetition in popular culture, he almost takes pride in all this simple popular culture and turns it into something valuable. But also, he found inspiration in everyday life objects. One of his most famous paintings is a can of Campbell's soup. What artistic it could be about a can of soup that you can find at the supermarket. Yet he turned it into a masterpiece that's been valued by a lot of art experts and people that like art overall. So pop art as a movement was trying to sort of go the other direction and embrace all those things that pop culture is actually criticized for and has been criticized for during previous decades. Let's move on to the next slide. So when we talk about pop culture, where does it stem from? What are the roots? So one of the earliest pop culture phenomena could be medieval carnivals, because they were inclusive, they were for everybody. It was culture that did not differentiate between different classes of the society, right? Anybody could go to a carnival, unlike, let's say, opera. That was traditionally an element of culture more common for aristocracy. So everything you could see at a carnival was highly accessible to everybody. It was popular, and it also united people and gave them some common sense of belonging, because everybody could go to a carnival and participate in it. So medieval carnivals were some of the earliest pop culture phenomena, some cultural elements that were available to everybody and also embraced everybody's cultural tendencies. This highlights the entertainment-related function of pop culture too, because obviously the reason why people went to medieval carnivals is not to get culturally enriched. They went there to get entertained. It was a celebration devoted to some kind of important date. So historically, medieval carnivals, the reason they existed was not because people were thinking, oh, maybe we should create something artistically valuable that people will remember in centuries. No, they simply wanted to be entertained. And that's why they went to those carnivals. Just like think about all those pop songs and pop movies, all the modern popular culture, same exact reason it exists, because people want to be entertained. And well, other people want to make money, but that's a whole different conversation. So the basic idea here is that popular culture, no matter how modern it seems, it actually stems from some of earlier historical phenomena. Let's move on to the next slide. And we'll skip this one for now. All right, so ancient Greeks actually had a similar categorization or dichotomy between drama and comedy. So traditional ancient Greek theater had different genres, drama and comedy being among them. And drama was considered high culture in ancient Greece, while comedy was considered as low culture, genre for common people. So in a way, comedy was pop culture of ancient Greece. Culture for everybody that embraced everybody's ability to enjoy it as entertainment. Drama, however, was considered a noble genre, and we'll talk later during week 2 about why and what was the reason. But for now, it's pretty interesting to notice that this dichotomy between low and high culture existed throughout the centuries. However, now in the 21st century and even at the end of the 20th century, those border lines started becoming very blurred, and it became really difficult to say anymore what's high and what's low culture. So it looks like those two different categories are becoming significantly more difficult to define. Let's move on to the next slide. So if we're talking about the hierarchy levels within pop culture itself, as I said, those borderlines became very blurred, and it's really hard to define what's considered high and low culture. And that's why when we talk about pop culture, scholars like Marcel Denisy define this mid-level category that helps us make this distinction more precise. So we have the high culture category, and if we talk about pop culture that we could categorize as high-level pop culture, we would talk about some of the popular but still educational resources like the New York Times, Chanel perfumes, National Geographic magazine, Discovery Channel. So even though it is still pop culture, elements of pop culture, at the same time they either have some artistic or educational value. And then we talk about mid-level pop culture. And this would be things that are highly recognized, yet they are also serving as a tool for making money in the marketplace of ideas. So here, if we talk about the mid-level, it would be Harry Potter novels. A lot of people believe they're well written and they like those books. Yet at the same time, those books made a significant profit for the author, and they're very popular. So we can say that it's mid-level pop culture. Or a lot of rock music bands. For example, a lot of people think that the Beatles or the Rolling Stones produced really good quality music. But at the same time, those bands were also very popular. It was not some kind of exclusive culture for only a small privileged class of the society. It was actually for everybody. Everybody could enjoy it. And it was highly accessible for people because millions of people all over the world like those bands. So we could say that it's mid-level pop culture. And then we have low level, and we could put all kinds of reality shows here, like the show about the Kardashians, the Jerry Springer show, Daily Mail, the tabloids that report on all kinds of celebrity gossip. This would be low-level pop culture because clearly it neither constitutes a cultural value nor it has any educational value. So it doesn't really serve any cultural enrichment or educational knowledge. Let's take a look at the next slide. So culture can be manifested through 4 types of channels: conceptual, material, performative, and aesthetic. Let's take a look at what they are and make sure that we can clearly distinguish between these 4. Conceptual way to manifest culture means symbols and language. Material means all material things like actual artifacts or structural forms. So for example, you create a building. That's a very material object in real life, so that would be a material way to manifest culture. Yet at the same time, the style of this building can communicate a lot about the era it was created, during which it was created, or when and where it was built. For example, we have traditional ancient Greek style. We have traditional Russian style of churches that I'm sure you've seen on some pictures. So there's a lot of, or traditional Chinese style of architecture. So even though it's a material artifact or material structural form, it also communicates some kind of cultural style, some kind of cultural message, cultural background, communicates something about its creators and their culture. So that would be material channel. Then we have the performative channel to communicate culture, and that's all kind of performances that people can do. Rituals, dance, music, traditions, carnivals, that's also performative. Opera, it's also performative because it's a performance. And the last one is aesthetic, and that's creative texts and arts created by the members of the group, things like poems, stories, novels, and so on. So we have these 4 channels, 4 types of channels that culture can be manifested through. So you can see that culture can take many different forms and be transmitted and communicated through multiple different channels or ways. Let's take a look at the next slide. The overall pattern, especially when it comes to pop culture, and we'll talk about this in theoretical terms next week, but the overall pattern here is that usually culture of younger generation, the culture of youth, adopts a new element or trend. Then it becomes common for mass culture, and it becomes accepted by the majority. So it becomes accepted by the general population as something popular or acceptable. So a lot of new cultural trends enter the mainstream through the younger generations. Let's take a look at the next slide. American pop culture. It became a universal source of trends for the global pop culture. So clearly, whether we see it as an element of the market, or we see it as something that actually reflects the state of the modern society and its trends, overall American pop culture has a pretty significant impact on the global pop culture. And it has been reflected in a lot of songs and books and novels and the popularity of American movies, for example. And interestingly, some of the artists actually criticized that because they believe that this global overarching pop culture is destroying local cultures that were created in some local communities. So again, just like any cultural phenomenon, there are different ways to look at it. Let's take a look at the next slide. So culture can also be political sometimes. And it's pretty interesting because sometimes you can find political statements in things that you would expect to be more entertainment oriented. For example, a lot of pop songs or pop movies have some kind of political ideas in them. Take a look at Beyonce's songs. They are pop songs, but there are a lot of political ideas there. For example, support for minorities and women's rights. Or a famous actress, Angelina Jolie, she advocated for refugee rights, and she actually used her pop culture platform to speak about this issue. The same for actresses like Audrey Hepburn. She promoted UNICEF across the globe, trying to shed light on existing problems in different regions of the world. So very often, even though originally we wouldn't think of pop culture as something that can actually transmit a political message, it becomes a huge platform for political communication as well, to transmit a certain political idea or value. So interestingly, now we have so many different sides of pop culture. We can talk about its artistic value, we can talk about its financial value or its role in the market, and we can talk about how it can interact with people's political views.